So we're going to be continuing our exploration of the Dhammapada. So we've been working our way through this rather rich and varied and challenging book for the last 4 or 5 weeks. Next week, I believe, is the last week, and I think it is, isn't it? Is it? Is it Sajaraja? Anyway, whatever. At some point, the series will come to an end. Maybe next week, maybe the week after, we're not sure. But today we're going to look at a section in the book known as Flowers. So in this section, the sort of spiritual life, we're given some guidance on the spiritual life using a lot of imagery of flowers and of scents coming from flowers. So that's why it's called Flowers. So they're all seen as a kind of a metaphor for the spiritual life. And I guess they were chosen because they were so pertinent to the Buddha's time in India of 2,500 years ago, where the world around us would have been a lot more perfumed with nice things, probably there primarily to cover the not so nice things that would have been available as an odour. And this section, I must say, I find this section quite hard-hitting and quite direct and quite personally embarrassing, because it really holds a mirror up to us about the state and the standard of our own practice. So I shall be explaining, I'm not going to go through the whole section, I'll just be picking little bits of this chapter. Feel free to read the rest yourself. And I'll be feeling quite embarrassed as I kind of explain what I am taking from these verses, because they are quite a high standard, quite a high bar is being set that sometimes we don't all manage to meet. So in a way, the subtext of these verses in this chapter really are, can we walk the walk, or do we just talk the talk? So we can all talk the talk, but the invitation is very much to make sure that we are walking the walk. So I shall plunge in and read a couple of the first couple of verses, which is verses 8 and 9, as I say, in the section entitled Flowers. Like a beautiful flower, brightly coloured but without scent, even so useless is the well-uttered speech of one who does not act accordingly. Like a beautiful flower, brightly coloured and scented, even so useful is the well-uttered speech of one who acts accordingly. So I'll say that again. Like a beautiful flower, brightly coloured but without scent, even so useless is the well-uttered speech of one who does not act accordingly. Like a beautiful flower, brightly coloured and scented, even so useful is the well-uttered speech of one who acts accordingly. So I'm going to just kind of unpack what those verses brought up for me for a bit, and then once I've done that, we'll look at another couple of verses and kind of unpack them a little bit as well. So what we're looking at here is it's an image of a flower that has no scent. So in a way, you could say it's kind of a bit of a useless flower because it has no scent. And the image is that is how useless we are if all we do is talk but we don't act accordingly. So we don't act in accordance with what we are saying. And the corollary is a beautifully scented flower, as it were, a useful flower, and how useful that is as a metaphor for how useful our speech is when it's coming from actions that are in accordance with our speech. So centrality of speech and actions and keeping them in accordance with each other. So we immediately get to see how challenging this can be. So let's just kind of like look at speech for a few minutes. So we may say, well, speech from a spiritual life in Triratna, 5 precepts, speech is covered by the 4th. And it says that we have to have truthful speech. We have to tell the truth. Well, that's very good. It's a very good place to start. So we might go to bed at night and thinking, well, I haven't told a major lie today. Therefore, tick for the 4th precept, I'm doing fine. I don't think we're really quite grasping the gravity and depth of what is being pointed at in these verses, if that's what we tend to think. So the Dhammapada here is pointing to speech being much, much, much more deep and subtle and profound and challenging than in a way just telling the truth. Truth's only the start of how our speech has to be carefully monitored and managed. And speech, as the 4th precept, like all of the precepts, the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th, they kind of all flow out of the 1st precept. The 1st precept being carrying out deeds of loving kindness in its positive form, or in a negative form, doing no harm. So doing no harm, doing deeds of loving kindness. So if we think about harm from speech, I think we can very quickly see how easy it is to harm somebody else with our words. I remember I'm in my 60s. I was at school I would have been about 8 or 9, primary school, primary 5 or 6. I don't think they called it that anymore. Anyway, but I don't remember that. Good. Around 8 or 9 years of age. And I had a friend called Fraser, and we had a teacher. We were in the same class. The teacher was called Miss MacLeod. Did I ever tell you I went to school in Scotland? So poor Fraser, one day, I can't remember what it was, something to do with geometry or, I don't know, something. Anyway, he wasn't getting it. He just wasn't getting it at all. And he was at his desk and the teacher was getting more, poor Miss MacLeod, she was a lovely lady otherwise. But that particular day, she was getting more and more and more and more frustrated that Fraser wasn't getting it. It ended up that Fraser was taken from his desk out to the front of the class. And I mean, this is 50 years ago, and I remember this distinctly. I remember thinking, oh God, Fraser, it's 4. Or, you know, whatever the answer might have been. Just it's 4, trying to telepathically get the answer to poor Fraser. And he just wasn't getting it. For every reason, it just wasn't getting in. And the teacher, in this kind of burst of frustration, said, "You look stupid and you are stupid." Exactly. I mean, I can feel that even to this day, 50 years later. I hope Fraser has completely forgotten about it. You know, we have no recollection of what I am talking about, should we ever meet again. But I remember it. It wasn't even directed at me. I was just sitting in a class. I knew the answer, but nobody was asking me. I remember the feeling, that deep feeling of harm of those words. And how often do we, some works of literature, some films are often predicated on a sense of, I'll never forgive them for what they said. It is such a powerful thing, the harm that words can do, that people will think that I will never reach a point of forgiveness for you, for those words that were said. Incredibly powerful levels of harm through our actions of speech, our words. How often do we wish that we could take back what we've just said? When we're angry and frustrated, agitated, when we're pressured, when we're stressed, when we're busy, and somebody just pushes that button, and before we know what we've done, we've reacted. And no sooner is the last word out than we think, I wish I had not said that. But of course, for us, the Buddha and the words of the Dhammapada and the precepts, they talk about speech, because in the Buddha's time, basically speech was the only form of communication. Nowadays, we have multiple forms of communication. So all of these things can apply to our emails, or to our text messages, or to our tweets, or twits, or whatever you call them, on that thing, Twitter, or the new one, whatever it's called. All of these are basically communications. So all of these things. So if I mention speech from now on, I basically mean the general sphere of communication. It's very easy with any of them to cause harm. But if we take the precept and we look at it from its positive point of view, that the deeds of loving kindness, then we can think, well, how does speech fit with loving kindness? And here I think the first precept of a deed of loving kindness and our meditative practice of the metta bhavana are very closely linked. So the practice of metta bhavana helps us work within the context of the first precept and vice versa. And I would say that probably the most obvious way that we can, as it were, gauge the progress of our practice of metta bhavana is through our communication, through our speech, through our emails, through our text messages, so through our communication in general. If we see that soften, if we see that becoming more loving, more kindness, then it's an instant gauge of how we're progressing with that meditation. And in fact, I would go further to say that communication is probably the central manifestation of our practice in general. So all sorts of aspects of our practice will manifest through our communication. So if we look and listen to our communication, we will be gauging how well our practice is going. So we've just kind of explored, in a general sense, ethics and metta, the correlation between the meditation practice of the metta bhavana and the knowledge and the working on the first precept of doing deeds of loving kindness, and how closely intertwined they are and how they would express themselves in our communication. But also we have to bring in our mindfulness. We have to be mindful of where we are at before we start communicating. most of our problems with communication is because we were not mindful at the time of making the communication. If we had taken a little bit of time to kind of see how we are, to realize that we're stressed, that we're angry, that we're pressured, and that we're being a bit reactive, that would give us the gap that we often talk about, to allow us to just take a few breaths, have a cup of tea if we've got time, and then communicate. Or to stay silent, depending on the situation. But mindfulness is central to the kind of the background of our communication, because our communication is coming from us, and we're in different states at different points of the day. We need to be aware of where we are before we communicate. And then, of course, there's also an aspect of how we speak. So I think with this, particularly when we're trying to do something like communicate the Dharma, we have to be really careful that our speech is measured, that it's accurate, that we're not using lots of jargon, that we're not exaggerating, and that what we're trying to convey can be clearly understood by whom we're trying to convey to. And this gets really quite tricky. I mean, I'm quite guilty of exaggeration. I often think, thinking of Dharma Day that we had on Sunday, just the other day, think, oh, there were hundreds there. There weren't hundreds there. There was 40 or 50 people there at max. But I would quite happily and quite readily say there were hundreds. It's just a kind of thing that you're just trying to convey that it was a successful, busy day. So, of all the things that can go wrong, it's not the most heinous. But it is coming from a lack of mindfulness. And in a way, it's not true. What that to say that there were hundreds when I know there weren't is basically an untruth. Hence, you can see how I was feeling quite embarrassed reading some of these verses here. They are very, very challenging when we think about how we routinely communicate. So a sense of exaggeration is not good. It's not coming from a deep sense of mindfulness, nor is it necessarily the truth. And jargon, it's really best to avoid jargon. Jargon might sound really great in an echo chamber, and we all live in our own forms of echo chamber. And Triratna is no different. So echo chamber itself is a bit of a jargon word. So an echo chamber basically means a kind of community that's developed its own kind of mores and norms and uses certain words quite routinely that they all understand, but anybody from outside might not. It becomes a kind of an echo chamber. So even in Triratna, you can hear jargon being spoken. So if we're talking to the order, and we're all quite familiar with the Pali or Sanskrit terms for things, then I think it's fine to use Pali and Sanskrit terms for things. But if we're talking to a mixed audience that might not be familiar with those terms, then it's best that we either don't use them, or if we do use them, we immediately explain in plain English what those words mean. So we might often hear somebody talking about Shraddha. It's a very common word that we use. Most people understand what Shraddha means, but we can't assume everybody does. So we have to qualify Shraddha as meaning, some circumstances often translated as confidence, other circumstances it might be faith. So we need to qualify these terms. And there are lots and lots and lots and lots of jargons that can creep in. And one of the reasons that it's not good to use jargon is that it alienates those that don't understand the jargon. So if somebody is talking with lots of Pali or Sanskrit terms without qualifying them, if you're not familiar with them, you'll feel alienated from what that person is trying to communicate. Their communication will not be working. So in a way, they're wasting their time. So it needs to be qualified such that the message is clear. Because actually, to alienate somebody through your communication, either giving a talk or writing an email to explain something, whatever the mechanism of the communication is, to alienate somebody is not an act of metta. It is not metaful to alienate somebody. We always want to be drawing people in with our practice of metta. We want to be attracting people. We do not want to be pushing people away. It goes against the grain of working on metta. So in a way, there's a little kind of aphorism, which I think we can, which seems to work quite well, which is we need to be very, very careful about what we say, how we say, and when we say. Sometimes silence might be the best response. So here I'd like to just outline 5 points that the Buddha gave about speech. This is in a separate sutta. I forget the name of this one actually. But in a separate part of the Pali Canon or wherever it came from, the Buddha outlined 5 points about speech that should be considered. He said that speech, this is quite a long thing, I'm just going to run through them. He said that speech should be factual. So that's where we start. It should be truthful, it should be factual. It should be helpful and beneficial. So our speech should always be helpful and beneficial. Our speech should be spoken with kindness. Spoken with kindness. It should be endearing, which is a lovely term, endearing. And it should be timely. Timely is very, very important. So there may be things that you think would be good to communicate to somebody because you think it would be good for them in whatever sphere. But if they're not ready to hear or listen, or they're preoccupied with something else, then you're just going to have to bide your time. Just bide your time and wait until they are ready to hear what you are saying. So you're going to have to work on your patience. Very often speech can be very impatient. You often see this at tea time, where there are conversations going around tables and people jumping in and talking over each other and not really listening, and some poor soul being left on the side who's not getting a word in sideways because they're not quick enough. There's an impatience and unawareness very often creeps in when we're communicating in situations like the tea room. And it's interesting to observe, and we should all try, I know it's difficult, we should all try to be more aware of these things. Because one of the greatest acts of metta that, in a way, we can practice in this sphere of communication, speaking, is listening. Very often, there's a conversation going on, you can see it, and people are just picking up individual keywords from what somebody else has said, and then from that keyword, they leap on to some other point, and then there's a keyword out of that, and somebody leaps on to that and makes another point. They're not listening to what the person is really trying to communicate. Listening is an incredible gift. It's incredibly frustrating to not be heard. To really not be heard is very isolating and quite hurtful. In an extreme example, anybody who's tried to interact with Vodafone or British Gas and you get some chatbot and you're trying to type away saying, you know, I need to check about my bill. And it comes back and says, you can pay your bill at http, blah, 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 www. And you know, that's not what I asked. I needed to check about the value. So you try again, and then it gives you some other nonsense response based on a keyword that was in your question. It is incredibly frustrating. And we kind of do it all the time in our norm. That's obviously very extreme. But it's quite common that we just don't really listen. And very often, one of the things that people love about coming here, after the general sense of friendliness, is that people often say, it's great, I really felt that I'd been heard. You know, they just had a conversation with somebody and they felt that they had been heard. And that is an act of metta to that person, to just hear them, to listen to them and to hear them. So we'll move on to some other verses now. So we're looking at verses 12 and 13. And these are sandalwood or aromatic resin, blue lotus or wild jasmine. Of all these kinds of fragrance, the odor of virtue is unsurpassed. Insignificant in comparison is this fragrance of aromatic resin and sandalwood. The fragrance of virtue it is that blows among the gods as the highest. We'll say it again. Sandalwood or aromatic resin, blue lotus or wild jasmine, of all these kinds of fragrance, the odor of virtue is unsurpassed. Insignificant in comparison is this fragrance of aromatic resin and sandalwood. The fragrance of virtue it is that blows among the gods as the highest. So what these verses are really inviting us to do, it's after the verses where we were looking a bit more specifically at actions of speech or email or text or actions of communication, this one's kind of broadening the invitation out and really giving us a metaphor for the spiritual life in total, the entirety of the spiritual life, and how that can be compared to an aroma which surpasses all other aromas and actually perfumes the gods, perfumes reality, perfumes the world in its entirety. Very, very beautiful kind of imagery of the odor of a spiritual life perfuming even up to the gods. And in a way, to live a virtuous life, it means that it's a life infused and directed and ruddered, as it were, by the 5 precepts, the 5 ethical precepts. So we're really looking at an ethical life. So it's a life infused by loving kindness from the first precept and a practice of metta-bhavana, generosity, stillness, simplicity, and contentment. It's truthful and it's mindful. So all of the 5 precepts should be infusing this life of virtue that we want to lead, because the aroma of a life of virtue perfumes even up to the gods. And there's another aspect sort of came through that imagery for me, which was the analogy with the essential oils. So the essential oils are there to make life more pleasant. So in an ancient Indian context, they would have been there to kind of cover or mask unpleasant odors. So they made a life pleasant by masking the unpleasant. And I think it's really interesting to think about that as an ethical life, masking an unethical life, or an actively pursuing spiritual life, masking a life mired in greed, hatred, and delusion with no effort being made. Because very often there's a sense that ethics is a bit dull, a bit boring. It basically means giving up, and you don't want to do it. Everything you like somehow goes against an ethic somewhere. And therefore, you don't feel particularly moved to do so. I know I've struggled in times thinking, I don't want to give up drinking wine. I don't want to give up. You might enjoy the taste of meat. You don't want to give up meat or become vegetarian or go from vegetarian to vegan. It feels hard and you feel hard done by. And frankly, you just don't want to. And in a way, that's completely normal. But what's really beautiful as a sort of subtext in these verses is that the ethical life is beautiful. But in a way, from my own experience, you have to discover that. You cannot be forced to give anything up against your will with somebody saying that it's a good thing to do. You have to kind of discover that. And you have to realize that the giving up is leading to something better than it was when you had it. So you have to realize that the clarity of mindfulness is actually more beautiful and attractive than the unclarity of intoxicants, whatever it might be, being drunk or drugs or whatever. So that unclarity that you might for a while feel quite attached to has to be surpassed. It has to be surpassed by a spiritual, ethical life, which gives you more than you had before. If it doesn't give you more, it won't work. So this is a sort of, invitation again back to mindfulness. We need to be very aware of where we're at and what we're ready to do and what we're not ready to do. But we need to have a sense of confidence about taking a bit of a risk and trying things out. Because if we're just coming along and we're relatively new and we give everything up because we're sort of intoxicated with coming along to the Buddhist Center and everything that seems to offer, and we do that too early, actually all we've just exemplified is that our mindfulness is not quite ready yet. We've not been mindful enough to know when things were ready. So it kind of evokes very much that this is a path. This is a path that we're all invited on, and that there are stages on the path. And if we're not ready, we're not ready. But the further that we go on the path, and as we get drawn along the path, we should find, certainly my own experience, that anything that is given up because something better is in front of it. Something better was in front of it. It's a very interesting verse, that one. There was various levels that I could see that sort of speaking to me. Yeah, we need to get engage with an idea of an ethical life as not being boring, not being one that suppresses us, but an ethical life is something that really allows us to blossom to our fullest. Actually, we're being suppressed by not being ethical, but we need to take time to find that out and to realize that an ethical life is the one that allows us to blossom to our fullest. The other thing it struck me about this, I was aware that one of the, I mean, we all have different reasons why we're in this room. We all have different reasons why we took that step from the outside world into a Buddhist centre in the first place. I hope we can all remember. I know I can. I came along with a life that, on paper was very full and quite rich. I had lots of material things going on, but inside me it felt empty. That was the reason, in a way, that I came along here. All of the nominally rich things that were in my life weren't enough. In the centre of me, there was an emptiness, kind of existential emptiness or whatever, or just a feeling that none of it really mattered, none of it really satisfied. Very much what Yashodaka was pointing at last week in his talk on the lakshanas. It was unsatisfactory, it was causing suffering, so on and so on. It's a very common reason that people come here. It's not universal, not for everybody. And it's interesting to think about since then, where I don't have all the material stuff that I used to, I actually feel much fuller. I feel that I have a full life. My life is full, and my life is rich. And I just kind of constantly have things that I want to be doing with my life. So an ethical life can be a very full and a very rich life, in contrast to the one I had before, which was materially very well off, but empty in the middle. So it's sad when you come across people who seem to have a life devoid of life. They're alive, but they're devoid of life. There's a sort of emptiness. And I kind of experienced that, but luckily I've done something about it. So, I've got life, and my life feels full of life. And the other thing is that leading a spiritually rich and ethical life is a very attractive life. It's very attractive to other people. People pick up on it. People pick up on that perfume. So we all know the story of the 4 sights. But we should all know the story. If we don't know the story of the 4 sights, it was in the Buddha's kind of metaphor for the Buddha's quest. He left his life in the palace, he saw old age, sickness, death, and he saw a wandering mendicant. So somebody that we assume was leading a spiritual life and was following some code of ethics, we don't know what. And it was, I mean, it's metaphoric, but it was on seeing him that the Buddha went off on his spiritual quest. So we could say that an ethical life is so perfumed that you can send somebody off to Buddhahood. That's kind of what happened in the Buddha's life story. It's a metaphor, but it's a really beautiful one for how attractive an ethical life is. That seeing somebody doing it was what sent Siddhartha off to become the Buddha. And also, on a slightly more kind of mundane plane, many of us here used to work in famous Windhorse Trading, the Buddhist business that was based in Cambridge. Several of us here all worked there. I worked there, fantastic 10 years of my life working there. And I was in the sales team. So we didn't sell in the chain of shops, which were quite famous, but we sold to other shopkeepers. And some shopkeepers, our favourites, would be invited to the warehouse to see any new products that had been delivered. So we would invite them in and give them a cup of tea and lunch and whatever, and then they could see the new products. And every time we did that, we did it a couple of times a year for a few years. Every time we did that and we had our top customers coming into the warehouse, they would notice that we were different to all their other suppliers. This was quite a common thing. Other suppliers did it too. So they would go to their warehouse and there would be radios blaring and people shouting and bawling and having a laugh. And they came to our warehouse. Sometimes our warehouse was in silence. And they would come in, people would be at desks. They would be quite quiet. They'd be quite mindful getting on with their work. They would talk quite quietly to each other. Everybody smiled. Everybody stepped out of everybody's way in corridors. All the things that we took completely for granted because we were all Buddhists there working together. But our customers were blown away by this. They were not used to this. And they all noticed. They all noticed that there was something different about this warehouse. And many asked if they could get a job there. If they could get a job, we didn't give them in. Anyway. So I think between the foresight and my own experience at Windhorse, several of us shared that experience. We can see that it does happen, you know, that people practicing does create some sort of perfume that people pick up on. And it's attractive. So, I'm a wee bit later than I expected. I'll just quickly now finish then by reading some of my favourite lines. They come from the Threefold Puja. So it's not from the Dhammapada, but from the Threefold Puja, and I think just completely encapsulate what we've been discussing. And these are: the fragrance of the perfect life, sweeter than incense, spreads in all directions throughout the world. Thank you.